Police in Sri Lanka have used tear gas to push back thousands of protesters who stormed the Prime Minister's office in the capital Colombo earlier today. The protesters are demanding that Ranil Wickremesinghe step down along with President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who'd promised to do so by today, but he's now fled to the Maldives apparently. Now, with Rajapaksas being overseas, the Prime Minister was appointed as acting president. Protest leaders say that the Prime Minister is a Rajapaksa ally and he too should go, and have warned of a decisive fight if he does not resign by this afternoon. Sri Lanka is facing financial turmoil following the COVID-19 pandemic, high fuel prices and a rising unemployment rate. Let's discuss the troubles in that country. We can speak to international relations expert with the Institute for Race Relations, Gabriel Crouse. Good to see you, sir. Welcome to the program. So, there's the ever-unfolding crisis in Sri Lanka. You've got a president who'd promised to resign by Wednesday. News broke this morning that he basically skipped the country and left for the Maldives. No one knows what his ultimate destination will be. Then the Prime Minister takes over in an interim capacity, but the population is saying he too should go. Who then should lead Sri Lanka out of this crisis?
Well, that is the sort of million-dollar question. And let's not forget that last week, Gotabaya Rajapaksa's brother, who was the Prime Minister, stepped down from that position. So an important factor to bear in mind when analysing Sri Lanka is that the Rajapaksa family has been predominant basically since Sri Lankan independence, or at least for the last 50 years. And this is not just in terms of politics, but also in terms of personal wealth. So both brothers have been now removed, one from the presidency, one from the prime ministership, the premiership, and as you say, replaced insofar as they have been replaced by loyalists or allies. I don't see a way for Sri Lanka to go forward sustainably without the promise of a new election. But even that will only, I think, delay the very hard decisions that are going to need to be made. One of the very important factors in Sri Lanka's crisis is that it's facing above 50% inflation. And as a result of its twin deficits, its balance of trade deficits, as well as its government spending deficits, its government's still spending more money than it's taking in, it's basically run out of forex. It's run out of foreign exchangeable money, so it can't import bare essentials that you need, amongst other things like petrol, to keep people on the roads in a very sort of hanty-scanty kind of environment where people don't have trains, they don't have mass transport. They really rely on petrol to get about for all business and just for personal commuting.
So, with that in mind, do you expect the crisis to get more worse in the coming weeks and perhaps even months?
I think that it's, at this stage, it looks almost inevitable. Sri Lanka needs a competent leader, a competent governor of Reserve Bank and treasurer to engage with the IMF in order to get the kinds of liquidity, the kinds of, I don't want to say bailouts because they'd have to pay back the money, but the kinds of loans necessary to hold them over. And at the moment, it's a rudderless, leaderless country with an outraged population. I mean, sometimes it's funny to see people swimming in the president's swimming pool. It reminds me a little bit of home. But of course, there are a lot of lives on the line here and difficult times.
Just on that point, you mentioned the likes of the IMF. I wonder how much of an appetite there would be to lend Sri Lanka any money, given the extent of the crisis, not just economically, where you've got a fuel shortage, a shortage of medicines and food, but also politically, the lack of trust among the citizenry in the political leaders today, unless indeed there is an election.
Well, yeah, exactly. There's got to be an election. The IMF is pretty clear about how it goes about business. It lends you money if you can show you've got a way to pay that back. So if you're an alcoholic and you say, I promise to stop drinking, that's not good enough. You have to actually show the ability, you've locked away the booze, you've thrown away the keys, you're not going to do that. Sri Lanka's problem, amongst other things, was it tried what we once called quantitative easing, did far too much of that. It blew up its money supply, basically printing money to cover the cracks of corruption and maladministration that had surfaced there. And what you really need for the IMF to get involved is a hard mechanism to stop that kind of thing from happening again. On the other hand, the show's not over for Sri Lanka. It's a wonderful country. Its GDP is close to South Africa, just 20% less. Its unemployment rate is down at 5%, or was before this crisis. So it's got a lot of young, hard-working people who are very keen to get back to business. It's got the talent, it's got the energy to get back on the right road. It just needs the mechanism to make sure that there are no more government officials that are going to make promises they can't keep, that are going to steal money, and that are going to cover it up by just printing out cash to cover their own failures.
More broadly then, Gabriel, Sri Lanka has a cautionary tale, isn't it, about how countries and economies don't collapse overnight. It's a gradual fall, but if it's not stopped fast enough, the situation then becomes what we're dealing with, where people have to drive for hours to find fuel. In some areas, there's no fuel at all. If you're sick, you have to struggle to find basic medicines. And the poor are unable to eat because the little food that there is priced out of their range.
Totally. It really is very desperate. And unfortunately, some of those protests are completely necessary, because Sri Lanka needs a fundamental change. But of course, the protests can be destructive too, adding fire on top of immiserated poverty. So there needs to be a turnaround. I think that as a South African, if I may, I really have been looking at this crisis since the end of last year, when economists were saying it's just a matter of time before Sri Lanka basically explodes. And I thought about our July riots last year. I thought about the warnings that we at the Institute gave before the July riots, and that we continue to give about the dire situation in South Africa. And I want to say something positive about South Africa in this regard. The South African Reserve Bank in general, and the Tseche Kganyago in particular, have been exemplary. I rated him the Person of the Year 2019 before the pandemic because of the major effort that he put into fighting against a political attempt to turn the SARB into a printing press for the ANC. He said, no, we've got a job here, we've got a constitutional mandate, and we're going to stick to it. And my view is that with South Africa in stage 6 load shedding, stage 4 flittering around, with youth unemployment above 50%, in so many ways we're actually in a worse place than Sri Lanka. 7 out of 9 provinces are poorer than Sri Lanka. We could be Sri Lanka. And at the moment, the difference between us and Sri Lanka is the fact that our inflation, bad as it is relatively much lower because of the discipline that's been exerted by the Reserve Bank. And I think they deserve huge credit for making the tough choices that are allowing us to at least keep going forward. But unless other factors come to play, unless administration clears itself up, unless bad, corrupt actors are removed, but more importantly, unless policy reform allows real economic growth and job absorption, I think it really is just a matter of time. We're looking into our own future, and we should learn a cautionary tale from that, just as you said, yeah.
Gabriel, Crouse, good to have your time. Thank you very much for speaking to us about developments in Sri Lanka, where, just to recap, by the way, if you missed it, in the last few hours we've seen the state broadcaster taken off air by demonstrators who are furious today after waking up to the news that the president had fled the country. He's said to be in the Maldives. The Prime Minister is now acting president, but people say he too should go because he was a Rajapaksa ally, and they don't believe that he'll be able to navigate Sri Lanka out of the current economic crisis. If you have not been watching those headlines, people are battling to get fuel at some point to drive. Only essential service vehicles were allowed to fill up at petrol stations in Sri Lanka. People are running out of food. There's an ongoing unemployment concern that's going to rise even further. And Gabriel was telling us that unless something is done to address the political instability, it'll not get, that's Sri Lanka, it'll not get any sort of funding from the likes of the IMF, which is when countries, or where countries would turn in a time of such great economic turmoil.